Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for another of our private networking, private LTE webinars we've been doing. This is the 7th in this series, I think. My name is Ian Gillett from IGR. I'll be playing host and moderator today. We have two speakers, Dustin and Jim, who I'll introduce in a minute, from Nokia and Geoverse. Just very quick housekeeping. I'm going to try and get into this as quickly as we can. We are recording the session today. We'll make the recording available on the website in a day or two after we've uploaded it. We will also send you an email so you know the details of that. Please feel free to share it, etc., etc. If you go to private LTE for enterprise.com, it's a mouthful. On there you'll find a bunch of different content, but you also find all the other webinars we've done as well in this series. So we will also be taking questions today. And if you just want to put the questions on the GoToWebinar panel there, there's a questions tab about halfway down. To submit the questions, we'll work through them as we go today. We'll also leave some time at the end to get into more discussion. And if you have questions after the session, then feel free to contact me and I'll direct you to Jim or Dustin as appropriate. So with that, our speakers today, as I said, Dustin Lamascus, he's the guy with the jacket on. He's head of business development for enterprise wireless for Nokia, or Nokia, depending on where in the world you're from. And Jim Jacobellis, who is Vice President of Solutions and Business Partners for Geoverse. He's the guy without the jacket on with the white shirt. As you can see, he's got his glasses on. He's trying to look smarter today. He's doing the whole thing. I'm just going to go very quickly through the agenda. Firstly, I did put the links in there for if you got more information or wanted more information on both companies and what they're doing, but we'll go through that today as well. So firstly, what we're going to do is I'm going to give a very quick overview of the space as we see it and the opportunity. Then we'll get into an introduction by Nokia and Geoverse, and specifically what do they do within enterprise networking, private networking. We'll then talk about what the main components are for those private networks. So if you're an enterprise and you want to build a private network, what pieces do you need? And how does it fit together? It's a big question with, it's almost like how long is a piece of string, but there are certain things that you do need, and we'll talk about that. Then we'll say, I kind of phrase this as a question to them is, look, both companies here have been involved in a lot of deployments with private networks. How did they get started? And this is a common question we get is, where do I start? I was having a conversation with a university a couple of weeks ago, and the IT manager's been tasked with deploying a private network and really just want to know, how do I get started? Who do I talk to? Next question is, well, how do we migrate from 5G when we're ready, or to 5G when we're ready from 4G? If we're putting in 4G today, how do we get to 5G? Can we put in 5G today as well? We'll talk about that. And then we'll also talk about lessons learned. As I said, both Geoverse and Nokia have done a lot of deployments, and there are lessons to be learned here that we can pass on to those of you who are looking to get started, who are planning, investigating right now. It's not like you're the guinea pigs. This has been around for a while now. I'll wrap it up and then we'll take questions. As I said at the end, we'll also deal with the questions as we go through. So just to kind of kick things off, this is a diagram I've used a lot. When we were having a run through the other day, I said, I'm really not going to use this diagram. I keep using it, but it's really a pretty good diagram. I probably need to add some more stuff to it. But basically, this is kind of the world as we see it in the next 5 to 10 years. And this is a 5G world. The blue shaded area is basically where there's 5G around the whole area. The yellow areas are really where we've got more focused, concentrated areas of coverage. So if we look at the manufacturing and transportation on the bottom left there, This could be a private network covering a warehouse or a manufacturing plant. Of course, we could have private networks covering a stadium when we used to have audiences that went to watch football games. Could be in commercial space, things like that. So, and the thing to look on this one is there's a lot of different applications. One of the common questions we get is, well, what do I do with the private network? And there's many, many, many things we can do, and we'll talk about some of those today. And so really the question becomes, what IT problem do you have? What business problem do you have that you're trying to solve? How can a private network and an application and devices all be brought together to provide a solution to that problem? And that's what we'll talk about today, is how you take those steps. So this is kind of how we look at the world. One thing I'll mention is we've always called this private LTE, because really we've been talking most of the year now about LTE, 4G. Increasingly now, as we're doing today, we're talking about 5G. So we're going to start moving this discussion to enterprise 5G, because it is a bigger discussion around some of those capabilities and a bigger set of applications. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jim. And Jim, the first question for you is the easy one, of course. Who is Geoverse and what do you guys do?
Thanks, Ian. Geoverse, to answer your question, is the U.S. arm of a telecom holding company by the name of ATN International. As you can see here, we have, in the U.S., we have 1,200 cell sites in 15 states with the associated licensed cellular spectrum to be able to provide roaming services for major U.S. international cellular operators. We're also the FirstNet partner to AT&T in 5 of those states, and in that same footprint, partner with utilities to provide fixed and cellular service more or less as a branded offering. And then the Geoverse brand is kind of more associated with private LTE using the CBRS band. And if you turn to the next slide, I'll talk specifically about that. So yeah, the brand Geoverse, as you will, is focused on leveraging existing cellular infrastructure we've had for years, and those kind of public-private service agreements to bring LTE, or as you like to call it now, 5G-like services to the enterprise, all while using the same CBRS spectrum. And when I talk about enterprise, now I guess you can throw government, schools, utilities into the mix as enterprise. And so typically what this involves is partnering with a radio vendor like Nokia, and then providing our kind of cellular resources, if you will, which is, network and core components that, connect those radios. And then, we also provide CBRS devices, such as smartphones and IoT related devices. And then on top of that, if an enterprise wants to have somebody manage that for them, we provide the managed services so that it can be real easy and seamless, and all they can do is enjoy the private LTE or 5G experience.
Okay. So I had a conversation a few weeks ago with somebody who said, I'm not putting you on the spot here. We in the wireless industry are really good at acronyms and confusing technical terms and all these things. And he's a director of IT for a university, actually. And the question, he said, we get confused between 4G and LTE. And I noticed on your slide you've got LTE and 5G here. So explain to me, and I know the answer, I know you know the answer, but explain to me 4G, LTE, and 5G, very simply.
Well, from a standards perspective, LTE is 4G, and 5G is the evolution of that. They give it a new code called NR, and so 5G is faster with lower latency than 4G or LTE, which LTE is synonymous with 4G from where I sit.
Right. And LTE is officially long-term evolution, I think. I've always called it long-term employment because it's been around for a while. It's done pretty well for us. Okay, great. I didn't want to put you on the spot, Jim. It's just I knew that question came up a few weeks ago, so it's a good one.
Thanks.
So, Dustin, I think most people know of Nokia. They may have had one of your handsets in the past, like I did many years ago. So, what do you guys do, and what do you do within enterprise private networks?
Sure, thanks, Ian. I would say, first of all, if you're enamored with Nokia handsets, we are actually producing those again through HMD Global with the Nokia logo. So if you want an Android Nokia phone, you have at it. From a top level, if the people on the call aren't intimately familiar with Nokia, I pulled a few figures here to help characterize what we do globally. As Jim said, we are an equipment vendor. We're an equipment vendor to Geoverse as well as ATN. In fact, Jim and I were talking. I used to be the account manager for ATN years ago, so it's a small ecosystem we work in. From a top line perspective, we generate about 27 billion. This is my own conversion from euros to dollars in annual revenue. And probably what's really pertinent for this call is our amount of R&D. We put $7 billion annually into R&D, and that's kind of the cost of admission if you want to be a tier one vendor in today's environment. And that's an average over the last 20 years. So 7 billion per year, year after year. It's 140 billion in the last 2 decades. It's just incredible. And then from a reach point of view, in the far right there, you see that nearly 6 billion people every day rely on a Nokia product. That's either from a handset, fixed networks, optical, wireless. We have a lot of different facets. But for today's conversation, again, it's really about private wireless. We believe that we are number one in private wireless globally. A big part of that is because we are a global organization. We have that kind of reach, but we do have more than 180 customers already on Nokia's private wireless solution. And if you go and go to the next slide, I'll talk about that end-to-end solution. And so from an end-to-end perspective, you probably hear this from some other equipment vendors. We have an end-to-end solution. I remember saying it back years ago with Nokia, and the reality is we didn't really have that. I was living in a bubble. There are other pieces to the network like devices, SIM cards, spectrum. There's a lot that goes into building a network. I do believe today that Nokia does provide a true end-to-end solution, and it starts with the devices there on the left. And everything you see on the screen, Nokia provides. So if you're an enterprise and you're looking at adopting private wireless, either 4G or LTE or 5G, we can provide everything that's required to do that turnkey. I think if you click one more time, there's actually a block at the bottom. From a device perspective, both industrial as well as consumer devices, our devices are typically targeted more for industrial networks, which our applications are. So you'll see things like IP67 rated handsets and tablets that you can use when you're wearing gloves. You'll see them support both CBRS as well as other private wireless bands like band 53. From an access perspective, that's really Nokia's bread and butter. We've got a radio for every solution you can possibly imagine, including 5G. And then with the recent acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent, we have a pretty rich portfolio around IP optics and microwave as well. We've developed our own core, which is the central component. We have a few different flavors of that. We typically deploy it as an on-prem solution, but of course we support cloud deployments as well. And we have built that so that we can scale down into the enterprise, something that makes commercial sense to the enterprise. Obviously, we're a tier one vendor here in North America. We don't have a problem scaling up. Our challenge was more scaling down, and that's why we created Nokia Enterprise and a core solution focused on that. And then applications, of course, are important. What we see typically, the enterprises themselves have their own applications that they're bringing to the party. They have some sort of business challenge that they're trying to solve, and either a better connectivity, better security, whatever is a requirement for them to get to that desired business outcome. At the same time, Nokia has applications that we can deliver. Push to talk, push to video, you can see the list there. And this actually ties into the little graphic at the top where you see that we've won the most innovative private wireless network strategy Part of that strategy is because of our ability to deliver applications using an application framework on top of our private LTE and 5G. A little too deep to get into this, but it is something that's quite innovative that Nokia's done. And then last but not least, spectrum and all the things that are required to enable that spectrum. CBRS working with the GAA or working with our partners, our tier 1 partners, our regional wireless partners as well, is a big part of our going to market, as well as working with innovative partners for execution of unique solutions. One example, working with Critical One Communication to build tactical deployable solutions in the middle of nowhere. So we work with those partners very effectively. And in fact, about 50% of our go-to-market is via partners. And then last but not least, services. We have 13,000 people in North America, and they're prepared to design, execute, and support any scale, anywhere in North America for your private solution.
Okay, great. Okay, so Jim, let's move on. Let's talk about what I need to build my network. You kind of hinted at this, started to talk a little bit on your introduction. But if we start from an enterprise point of view, you want to put a private network in. What do we need to do then?
Okay, thanks, Ian. Yeah, I think I'm basically taking what Dustin just said and creating a picture out of it more than anything else. So first of all, from a Geoverse perspective, there are really two main sides, to how do I get started. One of them is the network components, as you see here. The other side is the application or the device side, which I think is the following slide. But basically, it's pretty simple. And if you look at it, if you have a Wi-Fi background, you can see the resemblance to Wi-Fi in a lot of ways. It's just that the network components are different. There's more security. There's a lot of other things going on in the background. But basically, you start with a radio layer. In this case, you see it operating in band 48. That radio layer is connected to a core. That core can either be on-premise behind your firewall, or can be cloud-based. If it's on-premise, you do a local connection. If it's cloud-based, you have an internet-like connection. From that core, typically, that core not only provides connectivity, but it also kind of is the gateway to other things. Those other things are, the ability to get your own analytic data from the users that are inside of that private network. Before, if you were using DAS or you're using cellular signal, the carriers all own that network. Now you own that network, and you get the associated statistics and analytic information that was never available before. And then for public-private use cases, you can tie that core into the public cellular world for that private public experience with CBRS. And so see roaming links and all that stuff. It's not to worry about it, but this is a very simplistic overview, be a picture of the network side from a Geoverse perspective. So if you turn to the next slide, on the other side of private LTE is all the applications that you can enable. And all of these applications, again, it's different than Wi-Fi. It's based on having a SIM card in something, and that SIM card provides authentication between a device like a smartphone and a Nokia radio layer. And that SIM card goes in smartphones. It goes in, right now it goes in an Ethernet bridge or a router so that you can do your factory floor robotics. It goes in a walkie-talkie or a smartphone with a point-of-sale sled attached to it so that you can do point-of-sale on CBRS versus having it on a crowded Wi-Fi network. It goes in devices so that you can create a Wi-Fi hotspot out of them. And that's right now very popular with the virtual learning environment. A lot of school districts and cities are getting MiFi pucks. They're getting indoor devices that basically have Wi-Fi on the other end of them so that they can now do virtual learning with CBRS instead of having to rely on the cellular network. Or there's a bunch of students that may may not have had a proper broadband connection to do a true virtual learning. So CBRS and private LTE is filling the gap there. So starts with a SIM card, but you can do all this great stuff that previously you couldn't do before.
So to put it in consumer terms, I have a SIM card in my iPhone from AT&T in my case, or it could be Verizon or Vodafone, whoever. As you build a private network, you are running the network, as you said. You've got the radio and the core, so you are going to need the SIM card as well. So that SIM actually ties the device to your private network, right?
Correct. And in the case of the US is finally catching up to the rest of the world, and these new smartphones coming out have the ability to put 2 SIMs in it. So if you are a Verizon subscriber and AT&T subscriber, you want to use that same device for a private LTE network, you can. Or if you want to start by handing out smartphones or tablets to your employee, you can do that with a single SIM card, and we can make that single SIM card work not only for private network, but for public use when you're off the grid. So you can do it in a single or dual SIM way.
Right. Okay, great. So, okay, Dustin. So the next big question, as I said in the intro, we get is, well, how do I get started? And you put me a slide together here, so let's get started. So I'll let you walk through this.
Yeah, I usually take the most direct path first, right? So how do we get started? And what I've done here is I've reflected back on those conversations that we've had over several years. Actually, I started private wireless business development and sales almost 5 years ago, working with Google in the early days of CBRS. So even thinking all the way back to then, when an organization seeks to adopt private wireless, they're not really seeking to adopt private wireless. They have some sort of pain point. They need to create efficiency. One just quick example, working with a food processing plant in Northern California, they didn't have reliable labor to drive forklifts, so they reached out to Provectus Robotics, a partner of ours, to automate the forklifts to move stuff around their factory. But then they realized Wi-Fi doesn't actually support mobility that well, so they just needed a connectivity solution. So their actual business pain point was reliable labor. They didn't say, wake up in the morning and say, hey, I want to deploy CBRS private wireless with Nokia. They kind of backed into that. So I would say if you're an organization and you have a pain point you're trying to solve, try to gather all your pain points together and understand which applications can be supported by private wireless, because what you're going to do is you're going to create joint value across multiple use cases, multiple business outcomes. And it's going to be a little easier lifting to make the justification that, hey, yes, I'm going to make that private wireless. Also to this point is the segregation of applications between other technologies. So if you're paying AT&T for your macro network, that's great. If you have Wi-Fi, that's great. Private wireless doesn't necessarily replace those, but it gives you the ability to have another tool in your toolbox to segregate out those applications. So pick those business critical, safety critical type of applications, raise those up and put those on your private LTE or 5G network. And by doing so, you're actually going to lower the demand on the other networks and create the performance. Moving forward between understands, I know I spent a lot of time on understand because it is important to think about what you're doing before you do it. Designing the network, Nokia's here to help you do that. We have the tools. We can do coverage, predicted performance, all that fun stuff, both for indoor and outdoor deployments. Typically next, we go out and we do a pilot deployment, verify that those applications are realizing the performance that was predicted. And then of course the commercial deployment, and then migrating the applications over. And then last but not least, you need support after the sell. So, having the right support layer, and I mentioned Nokia has 13,000 people in North America to, at the ready to support the network, not just from the sales point of view, but also from support. So yeah, that's really it. It's I think it's a very pragmatic approach, but it's based on history and based on previous engagements.
So I think the answer to this is kind of like asking how long a piece of string is. Any guidelines in terms of from start to finish in terms of timing here? So if I were to start January 1, let's say I've understood my needs and I've pulled all that together, how quickly can you go through design, pilot, and deployment?
I would say we can move as fast as the enterprise can move. And having said that, I'd love that timeline to be small because small sales cycles are great in the industry. But the reality is it's complex. It's a big decision. if it's an infrastructure project. So it can take some time. I think typical, if an enterprise has made the decision, they're ready to move, I'm willing to say about 3 months-ish. We can go from understand to pilot in a matter of weeks, maybe 6 weeks or something like that. By the time we move commercial applications over, get into a steady state for support, I think 3 months are a realistic budget for time, depending on how big the project is, of course.
Right. And I know there's been restrictions on, you need access to the building to put the radios in, et cetera, et cetera.
Holes in the firewall, adoption of the devices. There's a lot of moving pieces.
Yep. Okay. All right, great. As just as a reminder, if there are any questions from the audience, just use the questions tab there on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll deal with them as they come in, or we'll save some for the end as well. Jim, let's talk about lessons learned. I know you guys have been involved. Obviously, as you said, you're part of AT&I, a big carrier. You've also been doing the private stuff with the private networks with LTE and CBRS. So what are the lessons learned here? If somebody looking at get started here and is thinking this is daunting, and what would you tell them?
Well, I mean, first of all, yeah, we have indeed been involved with quite a few kind of private LTE deployments based on CBRS. I think we started with our first one back in 2018 before the band was even cleared for use. You used to have to get like special temporary authority to do that, and so we started back. I can't even remember the day, but it's a couple years ago now. And before I kind of talk about the lesson learned, I think one of the big surprises is that the majority of private LTE deployments are actually outdoor deployments versus, if you were to go back and look in 2017, 2018, the projections were that 80+% of the deployments would be indoors. There's a lot of, extraneous factors that have created that, but that's the reality of the situation. So because of that, I think the big lesson learned is you are really going to need to tighten up your RF and system planning, more so in outdoors than you would in indoors. And devices that you choose, like for instance, some of the big drivers of these outdoor deployments are student broadband, they're city applications, and some of them are trying to get signals inside of homes, apartments, trailer parks, etc. And you have to understand what's called the link budget associated not only from the base station going down, but the device going back to the base station. So that is one of the big lessons learned, in my opinion, is to make sure that is in order. Most of these are in we got to do it now type mind frame, and so picking a partner that can not only give you the core locally, but could also provide a cloud service so that when you get started, you can get started quickly, because a lot of this is COVID related, and you need to spend federal money by a certain timeline, etc. And the other kind of lesson learned is, it's not necessarily the cheapest thing that is the best, and you could actually future-proof this network, this design, because if the school district wants to use it, chances are the city is going to want to use it. If not now, maybe later. And the city applications are going to be quite different than a school district application. They may involve a police department. They may involve city workers. It may even involve a utility if it's rural. So planning that and the evolution to 5G when you do this build is very much a lesson learned. And then on the in-building side, because things started with in-building and it's still going, it's been overwhelmed by outdoor, in my opinion, is everyone talks about all this fancy IoT stuff, and it's there, but voice is still a leading application, and getting a phone to work and so people can talk, as boring as that sounds, is still a leading application and something that should be considered when you design and build these things. And the number one use case that goes along with that is being able to have a private-public experience. So it not only works in your building, but it works when you're outside your building. And that's piggybacking into, asset tracking for just-in-time manufacturing, logistics, and things like that. These IoT devices also are going to have a private-public experience. So when you design your network, keep that in mind. And I put Industry 4.0, but it basically goes along with what I just said. That is when you're planning your Industry 4.0 initiative, public-private. Don't forget about the voice side of things and getting calls and phones and two-way radios to work in that environment is also important.
So when I was looking through the slides earlier, the one that jumped out to me on here was the outsourcing of those core services. I mean, the mobile operators that we buy service from, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Vodafone, and Telefonica, they spent years building their packet core in some very big data centers to support tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, right? So you're going to need that as the enterprise, but that same functionality is available in a hosted, outsourced environment in the cloud, right? You don't, as an enterprise, have to go get your own core.
That's right. Or you can, if for policy reasons, if you want to have everything behind your firewall, you can. It's basically evolved to, it's a software-based appliance now, and I think radios are moving in that same direction. So. Everything is going to be a lot easier, and the footprint is going to be a lot smaller. And I think that trend is already here, and it's just going to be even more, even more prevalent when 5G comes along.
Right. Okay. Great. So Dustin, I do like the title of yours, but been there, done that. So let's just learn.
Yeah. Again, trying to be very pragmatic and reflecting on a lot of engagements, and I don't have time to go through all these. So if you're in the audience and one of these, piques your interest, and I don't speak to it, throw a question up in the comments if you would. I'll compare TCO and the dues. A lot of times people think that private wireless is going to be more expensive, and as Jim was saying, many of these networks that we're seeing deployed are outdoors. And the reason I believe, or primary reason for outdoor deployments, I think, is because of the lack in coverage from a Wi-Fi network. Those of you that dabble in Wi-Fi pretty heavily, that it can be a challenge to do large outdoor deployments of Wi-Fi. And you can certainly get some reach, with using CBRS, and with Nokia radios, of course, you can use, directional high gain external antennas and stuff like this. So we at Nokia, we've just developed a TCO tool to do that comparison. So if you're interested in that, let me know and I can get you connected. But don't automatically assume it's going to be more expensive. LTE is typically more expensive than Wi-Fi on a device by device, just because hey, it takes more horsepower. It's a different ecosystem altogether. But at the same time, maybe you need far fewer access points, or Bs, or 5G cells, or whatever you're deploying. And then from IoT, Jim touched on this as well. Seems like we're singing to the same choir. IoT is not always prevalent. I agree, voice is important still, but when IoT is a driving factor, don't overlook the demand on the network. I don't want to pick too heavily on any of my vendor competition out there, but I know that if you look at the number of connected devices, for example, you'll see that you're quickly going to hit a wall. So don't forget that you need to plan for the future of the network, not just for today. And then when you're looking at an equipment vendor, the last bullet on the dues, you don't really know what's coming over the horizon. I put C-band out there. We've got the auction kicking off later this year. Make for sure you're buying into a vendor that's actually going to be at the forefront of whatever's over the next horizon, not just the flash in the pan that's here today. And then I'll try to quickly go through a few of these don'ts. From a Wi-Fi perspective, I hit this earlier. Don't think that CBRS or private LTE 5G excludes Wi-Fi. They're very much complementary. I like to joke and say Wi-Fi is great for cat videos. The reality is it's actually a great tool for connectivity in the enterprise, and it's been around for a long time. But at the same time, if you have mission critical or business critical applications, by deploying private LTE, that gives you another connectivity tool, another layer to segregate out the traffic on your network. And then last but not least, and I'll kind of leave this one open-ended, don't overlook potential challenges around end-to-end. I know what Jim and Geoverse are doing there. They're doing some great work, holding customers' hands from end-to-end, from device SIMs, access into roaming agreements and stuff like that. That's really great, and it's challenging. And he's taking a lot of the challenges, and Nokia's taking a lot of the challenges as well from a vendor perspective. And if you can find a vendor or a partner when you're deploying private wireless, I would say look to one that really has that end-to-end scale and scope and can really hold your hand through the process. It's going to make it a lot easier. Again, if any of these piqued your interest, be sure and type a question in the comments, but I think that's probably all I have time to cover.
Okay, so on the end-to-end challenges, are you talking of end-to-end deployment of the network, or bringing together all the pieces that you need to actually solve the business solution?
Definitely more of the latter. Yeah, so I think the first is the actual bits and bytes and stuff like that make the network, and that's certainly a driver for it. But then that creates a platform, and then that platform needs to solve a business need. And you can get lost in the bits and bytes. For example, there's a discussion about dual SIM earlier. Boy, there was a lot of caveats to that. Which SIM can be used? Can it be used simultaneously? Can you actually receive your Verizon call while your private SIM's connected to your private network? I mean, there's a lot of pitfalls, I would say, that probably Jim and I've already seen. We already know the answers to those. And then also we've probably seen other organizations trying to achieve business outcomes, and we're able to consult with the enterprise to help them realize those business outcomes they're trying to achieve.
Okay, good. All right, so last question. Jim, I'll go back to you. Moving to 5G. How do we get to 5G from, and obviously you're talking about CBRS here, so if we're on CBRS, LTE, 4G today, how do I get to 5G?
Okay, before I even talk, Ian, I want you to notice that I put LTE 4G in parentheses for you.
Thank you.
In this slide. So I think it's important to go and understand what makes CBRS different and so special. And if you look at the history of cellular, at least in the United States, stuff like LTE and 5G was standardized for exclusive use by mobile network operators on their spectrum. Thanks to the Department of Defense, organizations like the Wind Forum and the CBRS Alliance, they have now opened up 150 megahertz of spectrum for the enterprise to use for stuff like LTE, for stuff like 5G, and all the applications that go along with that. We're the first country in the world to have this come together, and now all the Canada, countries in Europe, Asia, they're all copying this, and they're all going to try and do the same thing. And so what has been done here is going to change the game worldwide and take that exclusive sandbox away from the operators and allow the enterprise to enjoy the wireless connectivity that goes along with this. So with that, the path to 5G starts with CBRS spectrum. And as simple as it sounds, it also starts with fiber connectivity to your building. If you don't have fiber connectivity, you can have all the 5G stuff in the world on premise, and it's not going to be a 5G experience. And the other thing is when you're planning your network, and you want to make sure that that network that you invest in today can upgrade to 5G, you better pick the right RAN partner with the ability to upgrade that software to 5G. Otherwise, it's going to be a rip and replace, and you're going to have to rip down that equipment and start over. And you need to pick a core that's able to do all the things that you can do with 5G. Otherwise, you're going to have to rip and replace that core. But all of this is obviously available now. The only thing that isn't available is the 5G chipsets in the CBRS band. the device manufacturers and the companies like Qualcomm that make the chips, they made them first for the Verizons and the AT&Ts to use because they get a lot of business with them, and now they're starting to make them for CBRS equipment. So you'll soon see everything from smartphones and band 48 that support 5G to all the IoT stuff, et cetera, come out. The standard is there, everything's there. But as I like to tell people, and I'll end on this note, I have not seen a use case where you could be, whether it be extremely low latency or high speeds, that you cannot solve with CBRS and private LTE today. Yeah, the future is going to be 5G, but remember that you can do a lot of stuff that you couldn't do a couple of years ago because of the way private LTE works in the CBRS band.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that because, as I said, I've been talking to a lot of enterprises recently, doing different interviews, and I think there's a realization that you can do a lot with LTE, but at the same time, the executives are saying we need 5G. It's got to be 5G. So it's almost like they want the sticker on there that says this is 5G, whereas in reality, it is something that could be deployed with LTE. It's because 5G has some very, very big capabilities that you don't need in a lot of cases. So it's almost like you want to. And I asked enterprises why that is. They said we don't want to be obsolete. We don't want to put in something that was perceived as obsolete, even though we may not need it. So it's a good point. It's the upgradability here is very important here. But at the end of the day, you probably don't need all that horsepower. Right?
Yeah, I mean, you summed it up well. But yeah, 5G has been marketed tremendously. And everybody wants it.
Yeah. All right. So, Dustin, I like the short path to 5G. You've got a slightly different, more of a technical view here with the different standalones and non-standalones. So, same question here. I'm an enterprise. I want to move from LTE to 5G. What do I do?
Well, if you want to go to 5G, just call 1-800-NOKIA. And we'll take you straight there. So you see my quote there in the top right from Sandvik. We did announce the 5G standalone for enterprise, not just for our carrier customers, but for enterprise over the summer. And we already have some uptake with that. But without leaning on that too heavily, I'm going to have to say I really agree with a lot of what Jim just said. First of all, is CBRS ready for 5G? Yeah, almost, not quite there yet. I'm glad to see Verizon spent a fortune and AT&T spent a small fortune on the PAL licenses because that's going to help drive the ecosystem, right? And that's what's really going to do the heavy lifting, particularly on the Verizon side. So I think we will see 5G and CBRS happening sooner than later. I don't know when that is. If I had a crystal ball, I would say we could start seeing some handsets and stuff like that after the first year in some sort of volume that's meaningful, not a science experiment. But if you are looking at your use cases, again, agreeing with Jim, the vast majority of them are going to be supported on LTE. I do have some outlier use cases, usually around autonomy. I had one use case in the DC area where they were doing LiDAR scanning for construction sites to verify that it was built as designed, and just a huge amount of data and mobility, particularly in the uplink. So having that broadband, that enhancement to the broadband was important for that. And then with autonomy, we're seeing some really low latency critical safety requirements. But it's easy to focus on those types of use cases because they do exist and they do really amplify the need for 5G. But at the same time, I would say 90x% of every use case I see out there is already supported on 4G today. And the last thing, I think you, Ian and Jim, you're alluding to this. 5G is not a light switch. You don't just flip the switch and poof, you're 5G. And that seems to probably contradict my architecture diagram that I'm probably not qualified to talk about. But it really is more of a dial than flipping a switch. And at Nokia, we have a great marketing team, and some of the go-to-market messages were around 4.9, right? So it's not 4G or LTE, it's not 5G, it's somewhere in between. So what you'll see is in the standards, there's tons of optimizations as you go from one generation to the next, and you tend to adopt those. And so those have been adopted. LTE is mature technology today. It's actually adopted quite a few of the benefits of 5G. But at the same time, there are profound differences between true 4G and 5G, and it comes down to the architecture, and that drives the path from 4G today. If you see on my architecture slide on the left, very simple, with an EPC and connecting directly to the radio. You have a couple of paths. You can actually home your 5G radios into your existing 4G core as one upgrade path. If you're really just looking for the mobile broadband enhancement, that's not a bad path to take. But then you can also deploy a standalone 5G core that then could be integrated for interoperability with your 4G. So you essentially have two different radio domains, but they're interacting with one another using two different cores. That gives you the ultra low latency, reliability, the additional benefits of 5G. But then of course, the other option is if you're Sandvik at the top and you really do have a use case that's driving the adoption of 5G today and you're doing a greenfield installation, you can go straight to 5G as well. So the good news is most applications can be supported today. And if they can be, even though I'm a huge proponent of 5G, if I'm sitting on the other side of the table for the enterprise, I would rather deploy 4G today because you're going to have a much more robust ecosystem. The price points for your devices, the number of vendors supplying those devices is going to be much larger. It's just going to make more sense to deploy 4G today. And coming back to my marketing team, the other message they had, in fact, the whole campaign was now to next. And let's get started now with private wireless on 4G, and that'll prepare you for the next generation, which of course is 5G.
And I actually like your charts here because we, as I said, we're in the wireless industry. We love complicating things with acronyms and names. We didn't call it option 1, 2, and 3. No, we went option 3X, yeah. Option 2A SA with LTE, and then just option 2 SA, which is standalone. I know there's also 7, 1, and yeah.
Yeah, and there's a whole plethora of options out there. This is the very condensed view of that. So we didn't get into option 7 or anything like that. But the takeaway is you can deploy LTE today, and there's a clean path forward for 5G, either as an augmentation to your existing core or as a standalone, depending on your use cases.
Right. Yeah. There's one thing I think Google got right with Android is, ice cream, lemonade, and Apple has obviously done it with their operating systems as well, on Catalina and Sierra. It's a bit easier to get your head around. So, all right, we've got some questions coming in. So what I'll do is very quickly here, so we do want to get the questions. So firstly, the private LTE is going to obviously migrate to 5G. Don't underestimate what you can do with LTE today. CBRS, as Jim says, does support 5G. It's we're just waiting for the chipsets. And obviously you need a 5G core there as well. And as we've talked about, 5G is being deployed by enterprises. We'll actually have a couple of questions on that in a second. And you can obviously migrate, you can future-proof yourself. What do you need? Well, you need a radio network, you need a packet core, you need a device with a SIM card in it. And if you want to roam, get call delivery from the public networks, of course, as Jim had that nice diagram, you do need the connection through to the mobile operator network as well. And you need some management tools. You're going to be running the network, or somebody's going to be running it for you. This is a private network, just like you have with Wi-Fi. Lots of lessons learned. Those two slides, I think, were probably the most valuable. There's great summary there. But the two things I pulled out, that is one, the ecosystems. We've got a lot of experience here deploying 4G and 5G in an enterprise environment, and you can learn from that experience. And obviously, Dustin picked on just a couple there, but there's quite a few. And Jim kind of picked on the obvious one. Is don't ignore the obvious. That I think a lot of people do this. They think it's got to be a complicated business case. It's a very complicated application. It may be as simple as providing voice coverage around a port or a warehouse or a building. You may want to put some security cameras on top of that as well, things like this, and not have to run fiber to a high definition camera, for example. So planning for the future in there as well becomes a very important aspect to that. So we do have some time for some questions. If you do have questions, just put them on the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. As I said, we've got some already. And so what I'll do here is, and Jim, I'm going to give the first one to you. I'm actually going to read it. And I think, Dustin, you'll want to comment on this one as well. So Jim alluded to this in some of his comments. It's often true that enterprise IT is slow to the party because mobile wireless innovation. How much missionary work are you guys looking to do over the course of the next year? So I kind of read that as, do you see the stage of the market here as there's a lot of education to be done? And I'll turn that into a separate question is, as an enterprise, if you're not deploying now, are you behind, or is this something that you see a lot of enterprises investigating today? What stage are we at with this?
Are you asking me this question, Ian?
I am.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd say the short answer is it varies by vertical. And let's just take healthcare, for example. I think most IT folks in healthcare are aware of CBRS. They have their opinions about it, and they're waiting for the right mix of things to happen so that they can incorporate it into their wireless plan. And that mix is going to include patient experience, guest experience, being able to incorporate artificial intelligence and things like that. Mm-hmm. That sort of education probably also exists in heavy industrial and mining and places like that. When you go to commercial real estate, office buildings, when even like with education, you have a lot of consultants consulting cities and schools on how to use this. A lot of that, you need to start from the beginning with. So I'm sorry not to answer your question directly, but the answer is it depends. And yeah, there are a lot of companies that have dedicated resources and times. There's an organization called the CBRS Alliance that where I'm a member, as Nokia member of the CBRS Alliance. One of the missions is to educate and advance use cases and promote the usefulness of CBRS. So there's a lot of groundwork still to be done, yet there are some more advanced enterprises in the mix as well.
So Dustin, same question. Do you see a lot of companies coming to you guys these days? Are you doing a lot of evangelism, or what stage do you say we're at?
Yeah, I can't say that we have a lot of companies coming to me because I'm in business development, and my boss would probably fire me if he thought he didn't need me. The reality is we do have quite a few coming to us. Nokia, of course, has a name. We're very present from a marketing point of view for private wireless. So we do get a lot of engagements coming to us here recently around K-12 education, distant learning. Jim talked a lot about that. We're certainly seeing the same uptick. And we expect that to continue because there's different funding sources for that. But then also, I like Jim's characterization of it depends on the segment. And certain segments are more aggressive than other segments. Certain segments are more prime for industrial, modernization, Industry 4.0. I had the reference from Sandvik earlier. Mining is one that we see, energy, utilities. These are the guys that are the early adopters for the technology because they have the use cases that are driving that need, but by no means is that exclusive. We're seeing transportation, logistics, several segments. In fact, on my team, we're divided by segment for the market. So we have people that are dedicated to logistics. We have people that are dedicated to K through 12. So it is very segment focused on, I would say, the maturity of adoption.
Right. So another question we had, and Jim, I'll let you answer this one quickly, and I've got another question for Dustin to wrap up. Somebody's asking about the SAS. for CBRS. We didn't mention that really today. I know this has come up in the past. It's come up in questions when people registered as well. Is there's almost like a perception that you have to pay to use CBRS spectrum, but you don't. It's free spectrum. But where does the SAS fit in? And you know, how big a cost burden, let's say, is the SAS?
Yeah, I mean, the SAS, I try not to bring it up because you end up going down a rabbit hole, because consultants like to fill enterprises' ear about, you know, the SAS, and it creates panic and all kinds of things. But because we're really sharing this spectrum with Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense has a dozen or so naval radar ships that still use a piece of this spectrum, the SAS, one of the roles of the SAS, and again, it's software that operates in the background, is if it senses interference with those naval radar aircraft carriers, then it will steer you to, you know, you'll have to go to a different channel inside the CBRS band. Mm-hmm. Also, there was recently an auction for preferred access to CBRS. If a preferred access user goes up and you're operating on a channel that they own, the software involved with the SAS will tell you you can't be on that. You have to go to a different channel. And companies like Google, like Federated, like CommScope, even Sony have gotten into the SAS business. So everything's interrelated. It's kind of software that is part of a Nokia radio. It's part of their management system. So if an enterprise wants to manage this themselves, they can, and there is a cost associated with it. Or as more and more folks are doing, is they're just outsourcing that piece to manage service, and they just take care of it and don't worry about it. It's software that operates in the background.
And in terms of cost, if I'm not mistaken, it's, you know, a couple of bucks per radio type thing. It's not thousands of dollars or anything like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of build it into the radio management costs, and it's not significant, but if you have 1,000 radios, you know, then it's gonna look different than if you have one.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So Dustin, last question for you, and we talked about this earlier. On your last slides there, you had Sandvik mining, I think it was, as a 5G example. And I think when most people think about 5G, they think of robots and drones, and they don't think of mining. So what are you guys doing there? What's that case study? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I guess first of all, you know, looking at mining as a segment, I mentioned it earlier, as one of the early adopters, and Jim and I were talking about this before we started as well. You know, it's an industry that's ripe for autonomy. There's safety critical factors. Typically, mines aren't in downtown Chicago. They're in the middle of nowhere where there isn't a macro cellular coverage option, and so that really limits the, you know, connectivity options for these companies that are engaged in mining. So with Sandvik specifically, they were looking at autonomy, and that was really the driver here. So they have these vehicles that are operating underground, very dangerous environments, as you can imagine. And if you're able to remove the human presence from these environments, then of course, you know, that's a safety critical factor. But with autonomy, you also have high demands of the connectivity layer around, you know, reliability, latency, even throughput, because you have all the sensors depending on what you're processing on board or off board. And so that really drove the adoption of that. As a peripheral use case, since they're going to have a great, you know, 5G standalone network, they've decided to also deploy both voice and video. Coming back to Jim saying, don't forget about the voice, right? As a augmentation to that autonomy platform. Another mine we have down in Chile, it's really about flat tires, which I always think is hilarious. Michelin, you know, provides these tires for these huge earth movers, and you need a connectivity solution that also works above and below ground. And so that was actually the primary use case for adoption of private wireless, was to monitor the pressure and maintenance of these tires on these earth movers. So it's really varied what you see out in the industry.
You know, I never thought of an earth mover having one of those little flat tire signs in the dash, you know?
Right. Well, imagine it being in a tunnel and having a flat tire and you can't move it, and it just blocked your operations for the entire mine.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. All right, 5G for time monitoring. That was a new one. So, all right, well, guys, thanks very much. We're about out of time. Again, if anybody does have any questions, please contact me, Ian Gillett at IGR. You can find us at igr-inc.com, as it says on the bottom. But I want to thank Dustin from Nokia and Jim from Geoverse for the time today. This was great. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.